Welcome and good afternoon, everyone. Let me start by saying I hope that you are safe and well. I'm Sarah Rosen-Wortel, and I have the great honor of being the president of the Urban Institute and to thank all of you for joining us today. So first, a few housekeeping notes. This event is being recorded. All of the participants are muted. And during the panel discussion, we're really hoping we'll get some questions and comments. Please enter them in the chat box, and we'll try to see if there's time. The panelists would love to answer them at the end. We also invite you to engage in this conversation online with your own thoughts and amplification using the hashtag #LiveAtUrban. Let me also start by saying that no conversation like this one today can do justice to the way embedded racism is revealed by the pandemic's disproportionate death and economic harm. Nor can it dwell long enough on the problem of persistent racist violence by those entrusted with safety and justice, or do enough to further the long overdue awakening to these ills that is being driven forward by inspiring passion on our streets. But I want to take this moment to acknowledge the pain and immorality to evidence in the world around us and let you know that we hope our conversations today will not just engage with questions of racism, but also provide one tool that might help us to measure results and impact, to judge if we're providing equitable access to mobility from poverty, and to diagnose more specifically where our efforts are falling short. In the weeks and months ahead, local changemakers, policymakers, community leaders, and philanthropists among them will be rightfully focusing on many complex and entwined problems, including, first, the pandemic response, helping their local residents get through the health and economic emergency brought on by COVID-19. Second, the moral emergency of providing systems to advance safety and justice that have legitimacy and act with fairness towards all our community members. And third, simultaneously, they must spur recovery, but not just to rebuild what we had before, where low-wage workers struggled for dignity and barriers to mobility left so many Black Americans and people of color locked in persistent poverty. Instead, I fervently hope that we will seek to build back better, to reimagine labor markets, housing markets, education systems, and policing, among others, systems that reinforce opportunity. Specifically, the work we're going to be discussing today centers on how communities can boost upward mobility. It builds on a collaboration between Urban and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation that began with the U.S. Partnership on Mobility from Poverty. The partnership brought together leading voices from the academy and practice, from faith community, philanthropy, and the private sector, to ask together what would it take to dramatically increase mobility from poverty in the United States. The partnership's work was deeply informed by the voices and perspectives of people who have or were experiencing poverty, and grounding in learning in urban, suburban, rural, tribal communities across the country. And one significant contribution of the partnership's work was how it chose to define mobility. Informed by research and community voices, the partners argued that it takes more than economic success to experience mobility from poverty. It also requires the dignity that comes when people have power and autonomy and a sense of being valued in community. The partnership's work informed many in the field and helped to shape the Gates Foundation's own strategy around mobility and opportunity. Our team at Urban has carried the goals of the partnership forward in several ways. Today's event will focus on how local leaders can promote economic and social mobility by using data to understand and to prioritize needs and to galvanize action. We'll be discussing a set of draft mobility metrics and plans for a new initiative to support community learning and action. While the metrics and the local initiatives were designed before coronavirus or the recent rounds of police failures, we hope these tools can be used to support leaders in their efforts to respond to these challenges. They're not perfect. We can't measure all we want to know, but they're a start that will help, we hope, will lead more communities to take a rigorous approach to measuring progress and understanding who's progressing and build accountability. We know from Urban's own research on inclusive recovery that some communities have recovered from past periods of economic distress in ways that also improve overall economic and racial inclusion. And other work by Urban suggests that perpetuating economic and racial segregation extracts a cost, one we should not tolerate when resources will be scarce and need so great. So while communities addressing emergency needs, we argue they must also devote attention to their strengths and weaknesses in promoting equitable access to mobility, as those conditions will be their starting point for recovery. And if we focus on their improvement, they should not prove a limit on what we can achieve. So as I turn it over to Marge, let me just say some quick thank yous. First, I want to say thanks to the panelists. Marge will introduce them after an overview, but we are really grateful to Rucker and Jessica and David for their work on the metrics, and we're really lucky to have them for the discussion today. Second, I want to say thank you to Sean Donovan, Mr. Secretary, as a public sector leader who has used metrics to push for change at various levels of government. We're really looking forward to your thoughts to help us make sure that we're producing tools that are useful to change makers. I also want to say thank you to Ryan Ripple and Kosar Jahani from the Gates Foundation. Your thought partnership and support has made this whole body of work possible. And finally, I want to offer my appreciation to the Urban team who've developed this work. Many have touched it, but let me especially mention Greg Ox, Stephen Brown, Claudia Solari, Keith Fudge, and Marge Turner, Urban Senior Vice President of Program Planning and Management, to whom I turn this over. Marge?
Thanks, Sarah. As Sarah said, communities across the country aspire to create the conditions that boost upward mobility for their residents and that tackle long-standing barriers and inequities that block mobility, especially for people of color. Doing so requires a tremendous political will. Sorry, I'm still learning how to advance. There we go. Sorry. Requires tremendous political will and a sustained commitment to transformative action. Clearly, data, a set of metrics, isn't going to do the trick by itself. But examples like Charlotte's Leading on Opportunity, Louisville's 55,000 degrees, and Kansas City's KC stat all demonstrate that metrics can play an important role in helping to catalyze local attention and action, focus on priority outcomes, sustain collaboration among key institutions, and ultimately to hold institutions accountable for achieving real change over time. Over the last year, with support from the Gates Foundation, the Urban Institute convened a scholarly working group to develop a concise but comprehensive set of evidence-based metrics that communities could use to track their progress on mobility. And this wonderful working group included scholars with expertise across disciplines, including economics, sociology, psychology, and political science, and with really diverse perspectives and frames of reference on issues of mobility, equity, and opportunity. The working group systematically reviewed factors that influence mobility from poverty and reached a broad consensus about a framework for metrics that are both supported by strong evidence and can be influenced by local and state policies. The framework begins with the three-part normative definition of mobility that Sarah mentioned at the outset. So mobility is not just about economic success, but also about feeling the respect and dignity that come from contributing to one's community, and having control over one's own life and the collective capacity to influence larger policies that affect one's future and the future of one's family. So the evidence shows that three key drivers help propel individuals and families up and out of poverty over the course of their lives, influencing all three of those dimensions of upward mobility. A secure and stable home environment provides the essential foundation for children's healthy development and for educational and economic success. Safe and inclusive communities play a central role in shaping families' well-being, their social networks and supports, and their children's chances to thrive and succeed over the longer term. Education provides a crucially important avenue for mobility, and for most people in the United States today, work constitutes the most important means of economic security and advancement. So for each of these three mobility drivers, the working group, identified a set of key predictors that are strongly associated with long-term economic success, with power and autonomy, and with belonging. It's really important to note here that upward mobility is too often viewed solely as a matter of individual ability and effort. But in fact, people experiencing poverty face multiple barriers that block their best efforts. These structural barriers to mobility include long-standing patterns of racism, discrimination, exclusion, and disinvestment, as well as present-day forces of economic dislocation and exclusion. So we focus here in identifying these predictors on local conditions that boost or block people's mobility, especially conditions that can be influenced by state and local policies. We wanted to help communities measure and track these supporting conditions. So our focus isn't on metrics that track individual residents' outcomes over time. It's on metrics that track conditions in the community that matter for the long-term mobility success of residents. For each predictor, the working group selected a metric, or in some cases two, that can be used to compare and monitor a community's performance over time. So this turns out to be much more easily said than done. In a lot of cases, the best data for measuring key predictors isn't available for the relevant geographic units, or it's not collected regularly enough, or there are long lags in its availability. Available data don't always provide breakdowns for different racial and ethnic groups. And sometimes metrics can be distorted by changes over time in a jurisdiction's population, for example, due to gentrification or population loss. So to the greatest extent possible, the working group selected well-established metrics that can be constructed either from national data sources or from widely available state and local administrative data. In a few cases, new data collection will be required for a couple of these predictors because potentially powerful predictors aren't currently reflected in widely available data sources. So just to illustrate how we selected metrics, I'm going to focus on the domain of work, where we identified two key predictors, the extent of employment versus joblessness, and access to jobs paying a living wage. For employment, our metric is the ratio of the number of employed adults aged 25 to 54 in a jurisdiction to the total number of adults in that age range living in that same jurisdiction. So how well does that metric do on our selection criteria? It's a very widely used and accepted metric that can be constructed annually by county from data in the American Communities Survey. In most cases, it can be broken down by race and ethnicity and other population characteristics, except in very small jurisdictions where it may be necessary to pool data over multiple years in order to get that kind of breakdown. One caveat about this metric is that if a lot of employed people move into a jurisdiction, or if unemployed people are pushed out, say by rising housing costs, this metric would appear to improve. It would appear to rise, when in fact conditions are not improving for any of the original residents in the area. For the second metric here, access to jobs paying the living wage, we we create a metric by computing, by dividing the average earnings from the median job in the area by the cost of meeting a family's basic expenses in that same area. So again, this metric does pretty well on our selection criteria. Data on wages are available quarterly from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. This local cost of living indicator is drawn from a highly regarded annual analysis conducted by MIT. But it's limited to the 365 largest counties in the country, which account for about 75% of our population. So for smaller counties, we'll need to find some substitutes or approximations for that cost of living indicator. So this metric is about jobs, not people. So it doesn't make sense to stratify it by race and ethnicity or other population characteristics. And unfortunately, it can't be calculated at smaller geographies within a jurisdiction. But it is not sensitive to flows of people into and out of the jurisdiction because it's about the jobs there that are available to people living in and around the community. So using that kind of process, we arrived at 25 predictors, each of which has either one or two metrics. And this set of metrics, as Sarah said, is by no means perfect or final. Every member of the working group had a couple more they would have really liked to add to the list, and probably a couple they would have argued for cutting. And in addition, there's still a lot to learn about all these predictors of upward mobility. So this should not be viewed as a final or definitive set. It will evolve over time as scholarship and on-the-ground experience evolve. We essentially see this as version 1.0 in a continuous process of learning and improvement that we're excited to be carrying forward. So despite those caveats, version 1.0, we think this suite of metrics provides a really valuable tool that community leaders, local policymakers, and on-the-ground practitioners can use to compare their community's metrics to peer communities in order to assess the extent of the local mobility challenge and build public enthusiasm for tackling it, to prioritize those areas where their community may be weakest in order to focus attention and action where the potential for impact is greatest, to highlight interconnections among predictors and across policy domains in order to recruit partners and identify the roles different actors need to play to boost mobility from poverty, to set targets for improving those local mobility metrics as part of a strategy for meaningful changes in investment, in policy, and in practices, and then to monitor those metrics over time to assess the community's progress as a booster of upward mobility and to hold local stakeholders accountable. So now I'd like to invite the three members who are joining us today from our Mobility Metrics Working Group to join me. We're going to talk further about some of the thinking behind this initial suite of metrics and about how they can be applied to help shape and pursue local strategies for boosting mobility from poverty as our country recovers from the COVID-19 crisis and grapples with the lasting legacy of racism in our institutions, in our policies, and our systems. So Jessica Traunstein is a professor of political science at the University of California, Merced. David Harding, professor of sociology, University of California, Berkeley. And Rucker Johnson, professor of public policy, also from UC Berkeley. And I think it's one of the pluses of the Zoom era that we can be joined by three Californians for this conversation. So Jessica, let's start with the predictors and metrics we discussed around the issues of power and autonomy. These are really key concepts for the partnership's definition of mobility from poverty, but not familiar to many who focus on social and economic mobility in public policy. So as we explored these concepts, you advocated for measures of political power as crucial indicators and suggested a bunch of really practical ways to measure political power. So given that we were pushing all the time for a concise but comprehensive list, how did you prioritize all the measures that you have in your toolbox for capturing this concept?
Thanks, Marge. So I'm going to sort of talk a little bit about how we came to think about this. One form of impoverishment is the lack of ability to make change that affects your life and community. In other words, to lack power. Having access to government policymaking is crucial to correcting that kind of impoverishment. In a democracy, of course, one of the primary mechanisms that individuals can use to affect political outcomes is to vote. And so simply participating in elections is an indicator of the degree to which a community is really involved in the process of controlling policies that affect their lives. Turnout in local elections, as I'm sure many of the people watching here, is often really low. It could be as low as 10% of eligible voters participating. So one of the metrics that we selected was turnout in local elections overall and by demographic subgroups. But just turning out to vote doesn't mean much if your preferred candidates and policies always lose, if you're shut out of the political process. Ideally, what we'd like to be able to do is measure how people are represented by the political system. But we don't know that, right? We can't ask people, unless we ask on a survey how people voted in an election, we don't know because of the secret ballot. What we can measure is the degree to which elected officials in a community are descriptively representative. And that's a political science-y term that means that the people who win election to office share visible, politically important traits with voters. In local politics, racial divisions are often a very important divide in policymaking. So we decided that one measure of power and autonomy is the degree to which racial and ethnic minority communities have elected officials that share their identities. So generally, we have compelling evidence that electing more people of color to city councils and mayoralties and school districts, school boards, does change the kinds of policies that are made in the community. Nobody has to look around very far to see that local politics and policy is crucially important for our lives. For instance, scholars have shown that having more people of color in government offices is associated with decreased segregation, different police practices and funding sources, increased hiring of Black and Latino teachers and police officers, increased social welfare spending, increased interracial cooperation, and more trust in government among people of color. So generally, we see these two measures as being reflective of one piece of the story here.
Thanks. And I think, Rucker and David, I invite you to jump in. You've also talked about the connections between these power metrics and some of the important metrics, outcomes predictors in other domains in our set.
Yes, Jessica, if you could expound, I think the important conversations we had about making the connections between the political power, representation, and the important policy agenda setting and policy priorities regarding who gets elected to local school boards and city council and state legislature. If you could provide some specific examples of the ways those policies greatly influence educational and economic opportunities that connect the dots between those metrics to some of the ones that David and I will share with regard to the other kind of economic and socioeconomic metrics of mobility.
Sure, absolutely. So my work has shown that increasing the representation of people of color on city councils decreases the likelihood that the city is going to engage in land use policies that create segregation. So this is just one example. And we know from lots of different sources of research and lots of different disciplines, economics and sociology and political science included, that increased segregation decreases life outcomes, in particular for people of color. It increases the incidence of low birth weight babies, for example, right? A crucial health indicator. It increases the probability that there will be a larger educational gap between children of color and white children. Sort of a host of issues that are related to residential segregation that is affected by the policies that the governments make, local governments make in creating their communities.
That's great. That's great.
I'll highlight that. Oh,
yeah, please, David.
I would also highlight that the connections go the other way, and that a lot of the other metrics, if we can succeed on those dimensions, are going to boost power and autonomy. So for example, if many people in a community are having trouble meeting their basic economic needs, they're going to have very little room and time and mental energy to engage in the activities that Jessica's been talking about voting, and they're not going to feel represented. Similarly, if people have poor health, if people feel unsafe in their communities due to violence and trauma and punitive policing, that's going to affect their feelings of power and autonomy as well.
Absolutely. And we know that turnout declines dramatically when people are impoverished on all of these different dimensions that David is talking about. It simply is not going to be something that people have the bandwidth to do, right? When they're trying to meet basic needs. So absolutely, David, really great point.
This is one of the aspects of our work together that was both challenging and exciting, and led us to this sense of a suite of metrics that really reflect the interconnected web of supports in a community that can boost mobility or block it. And makes it really hard to say, oh, here's this one thing you want to focus on. It really is a suite that needs to be focused on. Jessica, one of our criteria was we wanted to focus on predictors and accompanying metrics that could be influenced by state and local policies. And that was one of the things that to me was really exciting about the two we settled on political power, because you were able to talk about very tangible things a local government could do to improve outcomes on those metrics.
Yeah, absolutely. We know a lot about the factors that increase turnout and increase descriptive representation in communities. Simply put, making it easier to vote, having more polling places, longer hours for ballot delivery, same-day voter registration increases participation. But the most important factor for local turnout is whether the election is held at the same time as national elections. Local officials, state officials can change the timing of their election to coincide with higher levels of election. Local officials can also reach out to reluctant voters directly. The more people are asked to participate, we know that the more they're likely to do it. There are, of course, some people who are very hard to mobilize for many of the reasons that David just mentioned. These folks need to be convinced that they matter and that their participation is crucial to the outcome of their community and their lives. Supporting organizations that target mobilization among hard-to-reach constituents is another strategy that local governments can use. To elect more people of color, we have research on this as well. Higher turnout, it turns out, is one of the metrics that helps boost the election of people of color. So these things, again, are connected, as Marge suggested. But also changing the form of government, so changing the ways in which people are elected to office can really matter. Broadening networks, allowing for district elections as opposed to citywide or at-large elections has the potential to really increase the number of people of color in a government.
Well, Jessica, you made the connection to whether people feel valued, that they matter. And this is a set of concepts, David, that are really central to our definition of mobility from poverty, having respect, feeling valued, having the dignity of having an important role to play. And again, this is a concept that is often sort of left out, unmeasured, unspoken in work on public policy around upward mobility. And so my question for you is that, in particular, as communities work to recover from these multiple crises, recent and long-standing, how can really rigorous attention to this concept of being valued in community help local leaders rebuild more equitably?
So yeah, we have a couple measures of being valued in community. One of them is people's subjective sense of that, their sense of belonging in the community, how they feel connected to others, and some sort of more objective measures about their actual connections to other people who they could rely on for support, and a measure of social capital. And these kind of things are going to be critical as we come out and continue to deal with the COVID-19 situation, and come out of the recession and try to reform our local actions to respond to Black Lives Matter. I think the reason they're so important is that there's a long line of research that shows that when people are connected to others in their community, they're much more likely to engage in collective action. They're likely to work together, and that applies at the block level, at the neighborhood level, at the city level. And in order to solve these problems that are facing us, we need everyone to be involved, and we need to be able to engage in this sort of collective action. So simple things like, if we're going to deal with COVID, everybody's going to have to make sustained sacrifices, wearing masks, engaging in social distancing. If we feel like we trust each other to do that in our community, we're all going to be more likely to do that, and we're going to get through this faster. And so that's one example. I think rebuilding the economy from this current situation, changing our policies around policing, that's also going to require a collective effort. And it's also going to require attention to equity, obviously. And so the more people in the community who feel valued in the community, the more they're going to participate in those efforts, and I think the better the outcomes we're going to have as we go to solve these problems. I think our current moment, where we're focused on police violence and the many ways that our nation has devalued Black lives, basically since our founding, those have really highlighted in stark relief our prior failures at creating a community and really a nation where everyone is valued. And so that's why we need to kind of have our finger on the pulse of whether people are feeling like they belong and connected to others. Because if we're failing on that, we're not going to be able to succeed in making these other changes.
Thanks. A question for everybody is that I think as we worked on these metrics, we recognized the importance of these concepts. But then when we looked for measures that are available nationally to capture them, what was available was pretty inadequate to the concept, and measures adequate to the concept weren't available. And I'm really interested, really sort of where your thinking landed. Maybe Rucker, you could start on balancing this availability problem with the importance of the concept and the importance to the overall suite.
Sure. Yes. I mean, I think with regard to the measurement and development of the mobility metrics, a broad kind of view that we embraced was to not allow perfect to be the enemy of the good. And if we can't measure it, we have much less likelihood of fixing it. And so there's ways in which, even when Jessica was bringing out the political power representation piece, there's aspects of that you can have what appears to be diverse representation, but the structural inequity remains. And so it's imperative that we understand how to operationalize the ideas embedded in the construct of structural racism. The need for it to be concretized so that it's tractable, not opaque and vague, but rather to take our systems-based approach and think about ways that are not just focused only on like interpersonal experiences of discrimination, but are focused on the kind of community level factors. And I think one of the things that we understand is that the importance of using these multidimensional metrics that are more than the sum of their parts when viewed and measured as a suite, instead of as a buffet or smorgasbord where policymakers just choose a few they like or the ones that make them look the best, but rather recognizing the synergies between public health, education, housing, economic policies, that these all collectively influence mobility prospects. And so our mobility metrics were designed to take that reality into account and build in the best ways possible the extent scientific research evidence, but also to be a catalyst for local systems to spur more investments in data infrastructure to track these metrics across the country. So we recognize we face trade-offs between uniform availability of measures at the detailed geographic and how extensive that coverage is versus the depth or the richness of capturing hard to measure constructs that may not be available in many localities. And so those pieces were a big centerpiece of our deliberation and our conclusions on the matter.
So we ended up with a very small number that will require sort of customized data collection in the communities that start to use this suite of metrics. And David, I'd like to kind of give you the chance to speak to the community that might say, oh yeah, those are nice concepts, but I really can't manage the time, the commitment of collecting these new data. So we'll use all the other metrics, but we'll leave these valued in community, belonging measures out.
Yeah, well, I think Rucker put it well, in the sense that these metrics are not separate from one another. We can't think of it as a buffet. I like that analogy. They're so interconnected. And what we're trying to do here is to say, in order to make progress on one metric, you need to kind of have a baseline foundation on the others, right? We've talked about how they're linked together, right? Economic well-being is linked to health, which is linked to power and autonomy, which is linked back to health again. And so we could imagine that, if we make some relatively small investments in the metrics, then that will enable us to kind of create, and we pay attention to those metrics, that will allow us to create kind of a virtuous cycle where we're improving on each one, and that's helping us to move up to the next level and the next one. I would also say that things that aren't necessarily available now, they may be more available in the future. The counties and other local governments, they're going to start first. There's going to be a little bit of effort. Hopefully we're going to get you that support to do that. But the reason we are so good at measuring unemployment and poverty and arrests is because we've made investments in doing that, and we can make investments in measuring these things too if we all agree that they're important.
I would just add, just to kind of make a couple of these points clear, is there are a lot of recent studies that have documented how oftentimes we're skewed to look at the federal policy and even the state policy and kind of underappreciate the role that local policy is playing. But there are significant effects of like the elected local school boards and their composition on affecting school segregation. There's numerous examples throughout the state of, say, North Carolina, since we brought up Charlotte previously, where the redrawing of school zones in segregative ways, gerrymandering school attendance boundary zones that were affected by the composition of elected school boards. Even when we look at the example of local budgets on police versus education, we saw in Charlotte, 40% of the Charlotte budget's going to police, but they are re-evaluating those priorities to think about ways in which reallocation may actually have far-reaching impacts on mobility and other kinds of investments. And so we're hoping that our metrics can speak to those issues that understand the importance of measurement of both access and quality.
So that's a great segue, Rucker, to some of the metrics we developed with your advice around education. And one of those metrics, which I think is a little bit complicated sometimes to explain or to grasp, is one that focuses really on the intersection of poverty and race in schools, looking by racial group at the share of children who are attending schools with high numbers, high shares of classmates from poor families. I think you have a really strong argument for why that metric, despite its complexity by intersecting, is so important to our understanding of the structures in a community that support or undermine mobility for kids.
Great, thank you for that question. I mean, as we've kind of tried to highlight, part of the aims of the development of the mobility metrics were to pinpoint where disparities exist, where they're getting worse or better, and the factors that correlate with the local trends to expand opportunity. And racial segregation is one of the strongest, it leads to growing achievement gaps, and it does so in large part through differences in school poverty. And this is because racial segregation almost always concentrates Black and Hispanic students in high poverty schools. And so the measure recognizes the intersectionality between race and class by measuring the racial disparities in exposure to poor classmates, which can be measured within each district across the country. And this measure, this single measure of segregation is actually the strongest predictor, not only of the size of the achievement gap, but also the rate at which it grows as students progress through 3rd to 8th grade. And so it's not solely really about the racial composition of schools, but it's also very tethered to teacher quality, that in high concentrated poverty schools, we see a much higher prevalence of teacher turnover, inexperienced teachers, and teacher burnout. And as Sean Reardon and others have shown, including my own work, that every moderately or highly segregated district has large racial achievement gaps. And so that is a key aspect of our measurement. I want to maybe bring out just the other metric that we designed in the educational vein, and that is that learning rates, that is the growth rates in academic achievement between 3rd and 8th grade, reflect the opportunities available in the school and are much better markers of school quality than single time point or test score measured at a point in time. And that piece of things is partly underscored by the fact that data shows that students' early test scores are much more connected to family background, but they don't predict academic growth over time, indicating that poverty doesn't determine the effectiveness of the school. So we are looking at really the learning or growth rates in academic achievement and the trends in them between 3rd and 8th grade, which are reflective of changes in the opportunities available to successive cohorts of children. And in that way, we're trying to place a spotlight on the need for the community and the mobility metrics in this way to illuminate not only how community provides opportunity in the aggregate on average, but whether it's providing the same amount of opportunity for children from different backgrounds by race and class.
Thanks. And maybe Jessica and David could add on, there are a number of other metrics on our list where the top line metric, like that employment to population ratio that I described at the beginning, doesn't explicitly address racial differences in the way that, that the poverty concentration in schools metric does. Nonetheless, we've emphasized the importance of disaggregating all of these metrics to see inequities among them as part of a strategy. So I don't know if you've got examples from the other domains where that kind of disaggregation in the work at the community level is going to be essential to applying these metrics effectively.
I'll just start with, I sort of mentioned this, but turnout varies greatly between different demographic groups. And so just to know that 60% of the community turned out to vote in the presidential election is not necessarily the most helpful number, right? We want to understand where the gaps in turnout exist. If everybody turns out at the rate of 60%, that's fine, but we know that's never the case, right? So it's almost always the case that white residents turn out at a higher rate than people of color. Actually, Black residents often turn out at quite a high rate given their poverty levels. And so again, these things are all connected, right? When we have high rates of poverty, we have much lower rates of turnout. And because we have inequality in economic success between whites and people of color, that translates then into turnout gaps as well. Measuring this, studying this is difficult. It's hard to collect these data, but it's crucially important to understanding actually who has access to political power.
I would also add that, the Rucker was really emphasizing the importance of school segregation, but of course we have neighborhood segregation as well. And many of the metrics that we're talking about, we know are currently very geographically patterned and very, very localized, right? So because of that combination of residential segregation, school segregation, and geographic patterning of health, exposure to trauma, environmental quality, transportation access, punitive policing, that in order to really make progress on those, we need to know where the high points and low points are in a particular community, where to target resources, how to effectively run programs to meet the needs of communities and families that we need to bring up on these metrics. So I think most of the metrics that we're talking about are highly localized, and because of the nature of racial and ethnic residential segregation in this country in most communities, are going to have to be taken into account that way as well.
And in selecting metrics, we prioritized this ability to be able to disaggregate them either by population characteristics or by subgeographies. So let me begin to pull in a couple of questions coming from our virtual audience. One has come from Ann Yeoman, who asks, many places with no or not statistically reliable data are rural. And how can we support and measure upward mobility for these lower population areas? I wonder what thoughts any of you may have on that challenge.
I live in a rural area, so I'll start there. We can measure these things in rural areas too, right? And one challenge here is that many rural communities don't have the resources to build these kinds of databases. And so, that is challenging. And we should look to the Urban Institute at the start, right, to begin this process of helping communities to collect these data, and that's part of the problem here. Another important aspect of sort of thinking about rural communities is one of the things that makes rural communities so different is their physical size, right? And so it's important to consider all of these metrics with the lens toward, the metro area might have a geographically larger footprint when we're talking about rural communities than we're talking about in dense urban areas. But that doesn't necessarily change the way that the metrics operate. And so, I think for a first cut at most of these metrics, we can use them in rural areas too. Resources can be a challenge.
And I would just add that extending beyond the conversation only about rural versus urban, and in general, I think the point is that we can learn lessons from policy choices of comparable communities with fewer inequities to promote and spread the adoption of best policies and practices. So it may be that your rural community is not quite sure what policy choice, but with this launch of the metrics, there will be hopefully the capacity to learn some lessons from comparable rural communities that are pursuing aggressively ways to further these efforts, or maybe they're doing harmful neglecting certain investments and that showing up. But in any case, the idea is to cross-fertilize the information sharing about what works and how it works differently, potentially in different types of communities.
Another question that we've gotten from Ashley Putnam focuses on the involvement of communities in setting these metrics. Here we've been talking about the members of a scholarly working group. In addition, during this effort, we did a number of webinars and learning sessions with practitioners and policymakers and community leaders across the country, getting their feedback, their input, and in fact, that came back to the scholars and generated some revisions. But I'm really interested, all three of you have interest and experience in learning from communities trying to do this work on the ground. And what would your thoughts be on how we can continue to learn from communities as we test and hone these metrics?
You have to remember something you said during your presentation, right? Well, this is version 1.0, and we're going to go and try it in the field, and we're going to see how it works in these local communities, not independent of those, but in partnership with them. And the local communities that are willing to give this a shot and to be the pilot group can tell us which ones are working, and maybe this isn't quite picking up what we need, and we need to change it in this way. But that's, I think, built into the process here.
And I think the dialogue itself is a very big, important input to improvement. Meaning, even the working group, like all of us have blind spots. Our disciplinary perspectives lead to blind spots. Our life experiences lead to blind spots. It's through the shared conversation of the scientific with the practitioner, with the policymaker perspective, that when they're kind of blended and informed by one another, that's how the blind spots can get eliminated, not through a singular vision, but through a collective community partnership vision. And that's what I think the Urban Institute should be applauded, by bringing this set of working group members together to help spur that type of conversation.
It's going to be really exciting, as you say, to see how the next phase of this work evolves as we begin to learn from folks on the ground, really using these metrics to inform change. Jessica, there's a question from Carolina Ramos about how we reconcile voter turnout with ongoing challenges accessing voting systems. She references Georgia, for example, and highlights that barriers to voting disproportionately affect Black voters and other people of color.
Right. I mean, this gets exactly at what Rucker was talking about with structural impediments to equality, right? Structural impediments to equality are putting up barriers to participation, barriers to the vote. And so one of the key measures that I have used in my work to understand variation and turnout historically is how many barriers the state puts up to vote. Is there a literacy test? When does it go away, right? And we don't have legally literacy tests anymore, but we have functional literacy tests in a lot of places. And we have, the equivalent of that kind of lack of access to voting because of policies that are made at the state level. Now, one way to interpret this question is to ask, what can you do as a city leader if your state is doing something that is prohibiting access? Well, we do have some research, it's a growing field in political science, looking at the relationship between local and state governments and the effectiveness of local advocacy on state policy. So we shouldn't just be thinking about this simply as a policy that is only happening at the local level, but could happen in dialogue at the state level. And it's absolutely fundamental to recognize that there are structural barriers to turnout that actually have to be addressed before we can think about encouraging people to vote.
Thanks. So I think we have time for one more question, and this is another one that I think we did some thinking about as a group. For the most part, counties, or in some cases cities, are our basic unit of analysis in constructing these metrics. And we've talked a bit about the ability to disaggregate to smaller neighborhood levels. But Rick McGahey is asking, would we assemble counties together into regions and tackle some of the issues of intra-regional inequality and intra-regional structural barriers in housing, in jobs, in political boundaries. So invite your thoughts on that challenge.
I would say that's, yeah, I think that's going to be necessary, and especially in some of these domains. Think about the ones you mentioned: transportation, housing. Those aren't, isolated issues in a particular neighborhood or a particular city in a metro area. Part of what we're hoping to do with these metrics is to allow, as was raised earlier, to allow local governments to compare themselves to each other. Right? That should also facilitate the process of cooperation, right? If I see that my neighboring county is also facing challenges, say, around transportation or housing, then it's not meant to be competitive, right? We should be able to work together if we think there's links between those.
Yeah, I think, most of the measures that we look at could be fruitfully aggregated at higher levels and, ideally at lower levels too. And I think exactly as David is suggesting, one measure of inequality is how well am I doing compared to my neighbors, right? How many jobs are here rather than in the neighboring communities, and how might we work together to facilitate a more equitable distribution of that kind of resource?
It seems to me that in some cases that collaboration based on evidence will be fruitful, but I can also imagine situations where these metrics, comparing jurisdictions within a metro, comparing to peer communities in other places, would be fuel for advocacy organizations.
Sure.
This is an argument our colleague Manuel Pastor made a number of times, that you are really giving fuel to advocates to push for change that is hard and uncomfortable and will require the resolution of conflict.
I think the key is evidence-based advocacy.
Yes.
Yep.
Accountability here, which I think is what you're referring to. But I think there's also the possibility of saying, hey, look, our neighbor over here, they seem to be succeeding on this. What are they doing, right? What policies are they enacting? What changes have they made? If you're a local leader, you're getting bombarded by all sorts of things all the time. And it can be disheartening and challenging to look at the medium to long term, which is really what these metrics are about doing.
Yeah.
So being able to see what policies are effective in other comparable places, rural areas if you're rural, urban if you're urban, suburban if you're suburban, can, I think, provide some hope and some motivation to keep working on improving these things.
And intermediate outcomes, and the measurement of intermediate outcomes, so that we can see the trajectory and the trend of improvement, and not wait 20 years until eventual mobility outcomes are realized, but rather we can shift course midstream if the intention is not yielding the hoped for outcome, because intention is not sufficient to the task of actual improvement.
That is a terrific point, Rucker. I don't think we made it explicit earlier that all of these metrics aim to track change over a year, a couple years, 3 years, not over the decades it takes for a child's life chances to be realized. So this is a much more, are we improving conditions today for the people who are growing up in this community today? So on that note, I want to thank you so much for being such wonderful colleagues over the course of the year and for joining us today for this terrific conversation. And now I'd like to hand off the podium to Erica Pothig and Sean Donovan. So thanks again so much.
Thank you, Marge, so much for, and all our panelists for that very compelling conversation. I learned I've been following along for this work for the last year and a half, and in that conversation, I continue to learn something new. I'm excited for this next conversation and to introduce a former boss and colleague. Sean Donovan is one of my all-time favorite public servants. He has modeled for me how to be a policy wonk with compassion and empathy for the people we serve. And he knows an awful lot about how to successfully apply metrics to create more system change. Sean is the former director of the U.S. Office of Management and Budget, and also served as secretary of the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development from 2009 to 2014. Where he led the fight against the nation's unprecedented foreclosure crisis and was a leader in the development of guidance for the affirmatively furthering fair housing rule. Prior to the Obama administration, Sean served as the commissioner of New York City's Department of Housing, Preservation, and Development. Welcome, Sean, and thanks so much for joining us today and helping us really think about the application of these metrics. And I saw a few questions come up, wanting, I think, appetite for this conversation about how can leaders, local leaders, really apply and use metrics as a powerful tool to drive systemic change. And the panel talked about the importance of disaggregating by race and ethnicity and geographically displaying data to highlight structural barriers and disparities. And under the best circumstances with the most committed leadership, metrics can and do spark action to help identify changes in policy and decision-making that lead to more equitable outcomes. And they can also be used to hold systems accountable to achieving those outcomes. Sean, I think the power of metrics is something you've seen throughout your career and you've worked to utilize yourself. What opportunity do you see in using metrics to make decisions and inspire change?
First, Erica, let me just say thank you for the very, very kind introduction. I've loved working with you as well, and jumped at the chance to join you and your remarkable panelists today in this really critically important discussion. And I have to say, what we see around us makes it so clear how powerful it is. And I want to just use that as a jumping off point to answer your question. You know, I've always thought that metrics are enormously powerful in what I describe as a public servant myself, both the outside game and the inside game. And by that, I mean in terms of building knowledge and movements that move public systems, and then also from the inside perspective of a public sector leader trying to make change within the system. Metrics are incredibly powerful for both. For the outside part of this, you know, just think about the intersection of the COVID pandemic and the movement that we're witnessing for that is saying unequivocally that Black Lives Matter on our streets and our communities. I don't think it's a coincidence that at the time that public data began to be made available for cities and communities that showed this deeply disproportionate impact, that the rates of illness and death had huge racial disparities. I don't think it's a coincidence that that actually was happening as a prelude to the movements we now see in on our streets after the terrible killings we've witnessed in so many communities. And really, it shows the power of metrics, that as a broad section of the American people could see and understand that more Black and brown people were dying of COVID, it really creates an awareness of challenges and issues in our society that wouldn't be possible without that data being made available. And as we see in the debates about police actions, the ability to, just as a body cam makes a video available that allows truth to come out, making data and metrics available can allow the truth to come out and to create real accountability, so that it isn't just what an elected official says, it's what they do that matters, and whether the results are there. And so I think both on that kind of outside perspective, and then I would just say on the inside, as a public sector leader, it is often hard in government to know what success looks like. You've heard me say this often, and the power of metrics is to align an organization, an agency, a government around what are we aiming for? What does success look like? And then to drive change. It's often said, you manage to what you can measure. And I think that's fundamentally true. And so I think that's important. The last thing I would just say on this, though, Erica, is what I find so powerful about this conversation isn't just a general statement about the power of metrics, but about the power of getting below what are often kind of the surface perceptions of issues. And what do I mean by that? Well, if you think about stop and frisk in New York City, my hometown, and the origination of CompStat, which was one of the most visible and powerful uses of metrics early on, had we continued just to measure crime rates, I don't think we ever would have understood broadly the facts about the disproportionate impact that stop and frisk was having on communities of color. And it's really the metrics about belonging, political representation, all of these that we're talking about that really underlie economic mobility, that allow us to get beyond the surface and really understand the more complex dynamics of what are happening. You and I worked on the affirmatively furthering fair housing rule together, and we really were trying to say, it isn't just integration that matters or an absence of segregation, it's opportunity, right? And as we have debates about whether it's really, are we a melting pot or a mixed salad in this country? A melting pot would say, well, everybody's difference disappears. More and more as we value diversity, it isn't just an absence of segregation. It's really about healthy communities, whether they be Black communities, white communities, integrated communities. What is the opportunity that's available? And I think we tried to do that when we put the affirmatively furthering fair housing rule together, is to look beyond, to create a kind of suite of metrics, very much as you all are talking about today, that measure opportunity more broadly.
That's a really great point. And underlying that affirmatively furthering fair housing rule, for those who aren't familiar with it, was a data set, sort of a public good, so to speak, that was created by the department to be enabling of communities to do that kind of measurement. So not dissimilar from some of what we're discussing here today. So if you lift the hood on using these metrics, you do run into some very practical challenges in doing so. And I'm wondering if you could give us a little bit of insight into some of those practical challenges. But the question that was raised earlier, what does it take to build in buy-in? I think locally also, to ensure that the data can inform local decision-making. And here, local can mean community. I think it can also mean the leadership, the elected leadership or appointed leadership that might utilize these metrics. How can we be successful in that effort? What's your best advice?
Yeah, so look, I think there's been a lot of discussion about this already, and I like to think of it as exactly as I think Rucker said earlier. You can't let the perfect be the enemy of the good, and many of the tensions that you feel in choosing metrics is around this perfect versus good debate. For example, you know me, I love data. My temptation is always to have too many metrics. And if you're trying to create clear accountability, a public understanding of issues, you can't include the kitchen sink. You can't include everything. And so You've talked already about comparisons across place and time. And I think for me, this really comes to the tension between what I like to call measuring outputs and outcomes. A great example of this was, for all of us that followed the Moving to Opportunity demonstration, thank you, Marge. It took decades and Raj Chetty's data and other data to finally be able to say, wow, this really had an impact. The problem is if you're making policy, you don't want to wait 2 decades to see those impacts. And so often you have to pick output indicators or early indicators that you presume take the place of the outcomes or indicate the outcomes that you want in the long term. So there are tensions like that I think have already been mentioned. I'd like to add 2 things, though, to the discussion. One is how important it is for communities, for public sector leaders to pay attention to the biases that may be built into how we collect data and who responds. And the most powerful example for me is, cities across the country have built 311 systems. These are call-in systems where a citizen can call in, and they're kind of a hallmark of supposedly responsive government. And they're very important tools to be able to get input about the quality of services and to build a sort of citizen-centered government. But as we've gotten into them more and we understand them better, it turns out, not surprisingly, that low-income folks of color, immigrants, and folks who may not, for other reasons, feel comfortable picking up the phone and calling their government. They may not have the same sense of agency or some of the metrics of power that we talked about earlier. Mm-hmm. And so it turns out that, lo and behold, somebody will call and complain about the quality of their streets much more frequently from higher income, whiter neighborhoods. And so the data that can come from these systems can be biased in fundamental ways. And so it's really important to be thinking about how these systems are put together. And I think this really goes to your point about the ways that metrics can help bring tables together and create more cohesion and more ability to have a shared set of goals and policies in government. For me, an example of this was the housing plan that we put together in New York City, where we spent an enormous amount of time working with advocacy groups, working with neighborhood leaders, and investing what for some people felt like too much time in those. But once we got to shared metrics, those neighborhoods or those advocates may have been able to tell you, for example, that 311 data wouldn't have been perfect. But what we ended up with was a housing plan that had a very clear set of goals that were shared both inside government and outside government. And it allowed for a real alignment where, I think as Rucker said, evidence-based advocacy really focused on what are the ends that we're trying to reach. And what was most powerful for me is that even as the next mayor took over, even as there was a transition of power of public leaders and public officials, there was a continuity of holding government accountable and an aligned sense of, no, this is what we're aiming for. These are our goals. And so the power of those metrics in really keeping your eyes on the prize, creating a focus on what the outcomes are, really can be powerful if you invest the time and the energy to create a shared sense of what the goals should be and what the metrics are to measure that.
Yeah, your example recalled for me an experience in Chicago where I served in the Department of Housing, and it was the advocacy that put a set of metrics on the agenda. And for a long time, the department kind of resisted having to report on them and do quarterly meetings at the council. But it was with leadership that recognized that we were doing all this work to collect the data for these metrics. We might as well use them as management tools. And I think it was also that kind of shift that resulted in sort of the wider impact and change when you have that alignment between what you manage and also what's important to the community as well. So Sean, last question for you here is on the earlier panel, David Harding shared why it's so important to incorporate the concept of belonging into the measurement of mobility from poverty. And you already alluded a bit to that. It isn't a measure we have often captured when we measure mobility from poverty, but he makes a point that it is so interconnected to many of the other metrics that we're more familiar with that are drivers of mobility. How do you see policymakers and practitioners using a measure like belonging, particularly at this moment where there are protests in the street arguing for real action that demonstrate Black Lives Matter, and they should be valued in the same ways that white lives are matter?
It's such a great question, Erica. And I think to begin, it is both a powerful measure or powerful concept that we can measure that allows us to focus on where should we be investing, where should our efforts, where can they make the most difference? Because if there is not a sense of belonging, if there isn't the kind of social capital that comes with belonging in neighborhoods, then I think we're much more likely. Sorry about that.
No worries. You heard my children in the background earlier. So sorry, go ahead.
But as we really focus our efforts on where there isn't a sense of belonging, one of the most powerful examples, to use an example from your hometown of Chicago, Eric Kleinenberg's work is, I think, a powerful example of this. He likes to talk about it as social infrastructure, as the physical pieces that create a sense of belonging and social capital. But what he found was that in the Chicago heat wave, when you looked at neighborhoods that shared many of the same demographic, income, race, and other characteristics, there were huge disparities in the number of folks who died in that heat wave. And what he pointed up is that this sense of belonging really can be the difference between life and death. It's literally, if there is a sense of belonging in a community, does somebody come and knock on your door in a heat wave to make sure you're okay? During COVID, do they come and deliver you food because you can't leave home because you're a senior who's high risk or you're ill? And so there are ways in which belonging can make fundamental differences. And by examining this, I think we can focus on communities that are most at risk in many, many different ways, including for a lack of economic mobility. In addition, and this flows from it, is that it allows us then to measure, if we're looking at belonging explicitly, it allows us to measure whether the types of policies that build social capital, again, as Eric Kleinenberg would say, that the physical ways of designing communities that build social infrastructure, from everything from the quality of libraries and parks and public spaces, we can look at and measure, well, we've put a new library, we've put a new park into a community. We've begun to make changes in policing, for example. By measuring belonging directly, we can actually see whether we've got our finger on the pulse, whether we're pulling the right levers that can actually make change on that enormously important variable. Because we do know that it has so many different implications, from voting that we talked about earlier, to the ability of communities to be resilient in natural disasters and a range of other types of things. And so I think it's enormously powerful for public leaders to be able to have this kind of data and to really begin to, and in fact, it's something that's come out of the policing crisis in New York City, is the police department is trying to find ways, and on people's phones, to take very simple surveys to measure belonging in different ways and to measure the sense of safety. And ultimately, if I can go to our former boss, Barack Obama, it really is this sense of belonging and efficacy of power that translates into the ability to make change. And it's not just in government, but in the kind of movements that we're seeing on the streets right now. Obama said that hope is not blind optimism. It's the belief that destiny will not be written for us, but by us, by the men and women who are not content to settle for the world as it is, who have the courage to remake the world as it should be. And it takes a sense of belonging to have that kind of hope.
What a perfect note to end our conversation on, Sean. Thank you so much for being with us this afternoon and really illuminating and inspiring us in the application of this work. So thanks so much. Really appreciate you being here.
My pleasure, Erica.
Great. I'm going to invite Ryan Ripple now to turn on his video. And Sean, if you would turn off your video. There we go. Hello, Ryan.
Hello.
Welcome, welcome. So for our final conversation today, I'm really pleased to introduce Ryan Ripple, who is the Director of Economic Mobility and Opportunity at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Ryan oversees Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation's national work to strengthen pathways out of poverty and ensure all have access to the American dream. Over the past several years, Ryan has led the Foundation's learning initiative on U.S. poverty, which included establishing the U.S. Partnership for Mobility Out of Poverty that we discussed earlier. On a personal level, I'd just like to say that my colleagues and I are so grateful to Ryan and his colleague, Kosar Jahani, for their tremendous support of this work. Each has great insight, but also humility about how much there is to learn and that we are on this journey together. So welcome, Ryan. Thank you so much for being with us today. So as I alluded to earlier, much of this work does emanate from the U.S. Partnership on Mobility Out of Poverty and the comprehensive definition of mobility that we've been discussing. How did that work inform the Gates Foundation thinking and efforts to advance economic mobility?
Thank you, Erica. And let me just begin there and say thanks to you, Sarah, Marge, and the incredible team at the Urban Institute, and also to David, Jessica, and Rucker for their critical roles in shaping this work over the last year, and to Secretary Donovan for joining us today. About 5 years ago, we started this work to explore what it would take to dramatically increase economic mobility in the U.S. And we began really by being very public about the question and how little we understood in many respects what it would take. And that led to the creation of the U.S. Partnership, this extraordinary group of 24 people from around the country, leaders in their fields, practitioners and scholars who spent 2 years traveling around the country in conversation with communities, individuals, and families, trying to understand what had happened in the U.S. over the last several decades in terms of poverty and what kinds of solutions and interventions would be needed to help us move forward. They made it to 36 places, and we had the good fortune of learning alongside them. And an extraordinary set of lessons came out of that really have anchored the strategy that the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation launched just 2 years ago now. I think the first is something everyone has raised and talked about, that when we think about economic mobility in this country, it is not just a question of income. It is about power and autonomy and a sense of belonging. And we heard that time and again from individuals and families across the country, from very different parts of the country, about a similar set of challenges and questions that they were facing along those lines. And I will say since then, in the work we've launched, even as we look at matters in the labor market and workforce, when we talk to workers about the most important elements of the job that they value, income is important, certainly, but as important, and in some cases much more important, is power and autonomy over what you're doing each day, a sense of predictability in how your work will go and fluctuate. And so those lessons really shaped our orientation to what we hope we could contribute. I think the second important lesson for us is that poverty in this country is a story of systemic barriers and many different systems, overlapping systems. Individuals do not live their lives in silos, but we often administer programs in siloed ways. And we heard that time and again talking to individuals and families. And so we've entered this work knowing that there is not a single one or two things that a place like the Gates Foundation can go and scale right now that would dramatically affect all of those systems. Instead, we have to be at work and trying to move those systems along and reach a lot of leaders within those systems as we go. The last thing I would say that was quite important for us is just how important context is to this work. That place does matter, and structures of place are hugely important in shaping access to opportunity. The opportunities vary greatly across the country. And so as we think about our work, we know that our investment approach has to be mindful and respectful of those different approaches across the country. And so we go into this very humble, knowing that a place like the Gates Foundation really must be part of a much larger movement, must be an actor that is focused on partnership and working in collaboration with folks in communities on the front lines working on these strategies each and every day. And that's been our goal over the last couple of years and with this work as we carry on now.
That's really helpful, Ryan. Thank you. I think one of the ways you certainly shared with me that the Gates Foundation accomplishes this kind of work is through the support and creation of public goods that serve a broader ecosystem. Could you give us a little more insight what you mean by the concept of political goods and an example of what a public good has looked like in your grant making strategy?
Sure. So it goes to this point about the nature of the challenge too, that the poverty involves many different systems and structures. And so we can't build just one thing. We actually have to build platforms and tools that can help decision makers at lots of different levels across many systems look at some of these challenges in similar ways or better connect around the challenges that they share. So we call that a public goods orientation. And basically, at the bottom line is an attempt to help those who are doing this work day in and day out have the best tools available. And it begins with us really listening and trying to understand the version of the challenge they're working on and some of the hardest parts of the challenge that they face each day. So one example of how we've done this over the last couple of years is everyone may have read the book Evicted by Matt Desmond. As that book came out, it became very clear some of the data gaps that exist in the field, that you really couldn't go and get a sense of what your eviction rate is in your neighborhood or in your city or county, even though a lot of that data should be available in a publicly accessible format. So we partnered with Matt to help him launch the Eviction Lab, which has been able to make eviction estimates now available at the census tract level across 36 states. And that number is growing each year. That's been a very powerful tool because for a long time, that data was only available really to tenant screening agencies who could use it to determine eligibility for tenants who may have had an eviction in their past. And now it's a tool that can be available to advocates and those thinking about a better housing policy and how to think about eviction policy in their communities. We've seen places like Richmond and other communities across the state actually use that data to influence the legislative process and change housing laws to be much more inclusive and focused on affordable, accessible, stable housing. That's one example. We were involved in helping fill the data gap. We haven't been at the table in Richmond or at the state level in all of these places. Those conversations have been led locally, and that's really important to us. The second example I would just give is the importance and value of narrative. That we have a lot of misconceptions in the country about the nature of poverty, who experiences it, and why. And many of those narratives hold back resources. And so part of our strategy has been to invest in different approaches and strategies that will help us have much more accurate, inclusive narratives that combat othering and institutional racism, systemic racism that are so challenging. And data can be an important part of shaping those narratives. It tells a powerful story, as Secretary Donovan mentioned, that can influence how policy is made and how we think about a challenge in a common way.
Great. Thank you, Ryan. Well, this is our final wrap-up question as we bring this session to a close. Thanks for helping us reflect on this work. We're also on the last year and a half, but we're also really excited to announce the second phase of it. And there have been a few questions in the chat because we've alluded to it throughout the conversation. And we'll have more details in the weeks ahead. We will be kicking off a 2-year process to beta test these metrics with a set of counties. We'll launch an RFP this summer that will invite counties to apply for technical assistance to work with urban to develop local strategies and informed by the metrics. I mean, throughout that process, we're really going to learn about the usefulness of the metrics and how they can be robust and inclusive. And we'll be creating opportunities for thought partnership with a field of organizations and experts that are also focused on mobility. So Ryan, as we wrap up with the last minute or so, what do you see as the Foundation's goals and hopes for this work?
Well, we're so excited about this next phase because it's a chance to build a learning community, actually, where we can learn from places and local leaders who want to put these metrics to work, evaluate where they meet a need, where they may fall short, what other metrics could be helpful, what metrics locally are being used that could be integrated into this list, and how we think about an evolving set of metrics going forward that reflect all dimensions of this challenge: dignity, power, belonging, as well as income challenges. So we're very excited to be working with Urban to kick off this call to action, so to speak, and the next phase where we'll have a chance to work directly with people and places who want to put these to work.
Wonderful. Thank you. And thanks for the support. And stay tuned, everyone. We'll be sending out more information shortly with more details on the RFP and the opportunity. But thank you, Ryan, so much again for your support of this work and participation in today's session. Thank you, everyone. Be safe, be well, take care.